Despite only serving for a little over 2 weeks, his death sent shockwaves throughout Australia, and he immediately entered the history books, even if his name was lost in the ether. He quickly became a rallying point for those who opposed the war as the first conscript killed in Vietnam. Welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military history podcast. This is the life, service and legacy of Private Errol Noack, a national serviceman who served as section machine gunner as part of the 5th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment during the Vietnam War. Errol Noack was born on the 28th of March 1945 in North Adelaide, the only child of Walter Henrik Noack, a mechanic, and his wife, Dorothy Muriel Wilson. Originally named Errol Wilson Noack, however, following the breakdown of his parents' marriage and subsequent divorce in 1947, his middle name was changed to Wayne. Aside from a brief period where he lived with his aunt and uncle, Herb and Lois Noack, he would be raised solely by his father. Despite the rather acrimonious breakdown of his parents' marriage, Noack apparently still remained in contact with members of his mother's family, including spending summers with maternal cousins and grandparents. He was brought up in the Lutheran faith, and as he grew up, he joined the staff of his local Sunday school and participated in many of the youth activities. Due to interruptions in his schooling, it wouldn't be until 1963, at the age of 18, that Noack would complete his intermediate year of schooling at Concordia College in Highgate, Adelaide, where there he'd be considered an academically average student. He would go on to be a driver at the Saff Coal Cannery in Port Lincoln, before moving to Adelaide to work briefly in the Myer department store as a salesman and fit model, before returning home to work with his father as a tuna fisherman. After 4 months of father and son working together, Noack's number was called in the birthday ballot and his draft papers soon arrived. While Australia always had provisions for compulsory military service as outlined in the 1903 Defence Act, it had only been activated twice before the establishment of the Australian Regular Army in 1947, both of which were just prior to the World Wars. One aspect of the 1903 Act that remained consistent up until this point was that all Australian service personnel could not be compelled to serve outside of Australia's territorial waters, and any permanently raised unit couldn't be deployed overseas. This was with the intent of the Defence Act, which was to raise a purely defensive force. This is what necessitated the raising of the all-volunteer Australian Imperial Forces of both World Wars and the conscription referendums of the First World War. The National Service Act 1951 was the third activation of the conscription clause of the Defence Act, and was enacted due to the rise of communist insurgencies in Southeast Asia and the Korean War, thus calling on compulsory service for men aged 20 and up, but was repealed in 1959. The fourth and final time that compulsory military service has been called, as of date of recording, was the National Service Act of 1964. This required all 20-year-old males to register for military service for a period of 2 years. This excluded married men, those already in the permanent and citizens' forces, and those who worked in theological professions, such as members of the clergy. It also excluded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Initially, draftees could elect to serve in either the Australian Regular Army and be sent where the military required them, or to serve in the Citizens Military Force and do their service domestically. The year after it was implemented, the Menzies government enacted a change that removed the distinction between both branches of the Army. What this meant was, compared to previous amendments and additions to the 1903 Defence Act, was that it removed the requirement that those who were called up for military service had to volunteer to be sent overseas. This meant that all draftees and those who enlisted voluntarily could be sent wherever the military required them, including into combat. As the number of Australian males turning 20 every year vastly exceeded the Australian Regular Army's operational requirements and its ability to train, a birthday ballot system was instituted in which all males whose birthdays had been drawn via a lottery would then receive a notice from the Department of Labour and National Service, outlining the date they needed to present to basic training, and gave them the necessary information if they wished to seek an exemption, of which there were very few accepted reasons. Once the draftee got through this process, they still actually had to meet the physical and mental requirements of basic training. After receiving his call-up, Noack visited the Adelaide Labor MP Clive Cameron to ask what he should do. Cameron, who remembered him as a fine young man, asked him if the Lutheran faith allowed him to kill another human being. When Noack said no, the MP advised him to register as a conscientious objector, one of the exemptions available. Noack decided against this course of action and then went to his local pastor and friend, G.E. Fisher. "I don't want to go to war, but I must obey the call to duty. I will go and do my best." and according to his uncle Herb, since there was nothing he could do about it, he decided to make the most of it. Even with these declarations, Noack didn't take to soldiering very well. He presented to Keswick Barracks in the 30th of June 1965 to commence his service as a NASHO, or National Serviceman, in which he was amongst the first intake. He was sent to the 2nd Recruit Training Battalion at Puckapunyal, Victoria for basic training, and there he had several disciplinary infractions for comparatively minor issues, but was rated a competent soldier. His mates gave him the nickname Flex, referencing to his large physique and massive biceps, and by all accounts he was considered an easygoing guy. He was posted to the newly raised 5th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment and was allotted to 5 Platoon B Company. Owing to his 6'1" frame, he was given the role of section machine gunner. Further training followed, including at Canungra, Queensland, where the men learned to operate in the jungle environment. While on exercises in Western Australia to sit for selection as a reinforcement for the Special Air Service, he was reported to have lacked enthusiasm and application, nor did he have the standards of self-discipline, which rendered him not acceptable to join the Special Forces Regiment. While in Western Australia, he also apparently began a relationship with a local girl, Sandra Harrison, who held the belief that they would get married as soon as he completed his national service. For his final leave, Noack stayed with his father in their caravan at Port Lincoln, where he belatedly celebrated his 21st birthday on the 8th of May 1966 by taking a final swim at nearby Curtin Point before driving to Adelaide. Here, Noack took Holy Communion at the family's church before being taken to the airport. On the 8th of May 1966, Noack was flown to Vietnam with a number of his comrades. There he took part in several patrols and training exercises to acclimatise to the country in the surrounding jungles of the Australian logistical base of Vung Tau, a port city on a peninsula in southern Vietnam taken over by the 1st Australian Logistical Support Group to serve as a depot for all Australian supplies and reinforcements into and out of the country. After his first week in Vietnam, he wrote to his Aunt Lois, mentioning the constant rain and hot tropical sun that dried things out quickly. He also apparently apologised for his writing and grammar, as he had consumed a number of beers after returning from a patrol. On the 24th of May, 5 RAR was taken by helicopter from Vung Tau to a landing zone near Nui Dat, and immediately took part in the battalion's first involvement in the Vietnam War, Operation Hardihood. Operation Hardihood was a joint Australian-United States Army security operation from the 16th of May to the 6th of June, and comprised of the 1st and 5th Battalions, Royal Australian Regiment, and the 503rd Infantry Regiment, 173rd Airborne Division, United States Army. It participated within the Phuoc Toi province around Nui Dat for the establishment of the base area for the newly raised 1st Australian Task Force. This base would be from where all further Australian operations would be conducted. This operation was the result of the Australian government at the time's announcement that the current Australian military presence in Vietnam would be expanded from a single battalion to a full task force, comprising of armour, aviation, engineers, and artillery support. Prior to this point, Australian forces slotted into the United States force organisation and acted as a subordinate unit. This change would allow for greater autonomy in the Australian operations. 5 RAR was tasked from the 24th of May to clear the area around Nui Dat of Viet Cong in the area of 6,000 metres east and northeast of Nui Dat. The battalion's A and B companies were tasked with clearing to the northern edge of the area of operation, while its C and D companies cleared to the north and south. The terrain the Australian troops were operating in was thick with vegetation that limited visibility to 18 metres in some places, which made movements incredibly slow and difficult to orientate. To aid in this, each company was given natural boundaries to operate, such as tracks or streams instead of arbitrary lines drawn on a map, so the patrols could easily see when they'd reached the limit of their area. After a full day of stressful patrols in which A Company encountered sporadic groups of Viet Cong, B Company, of which Noack was assigned, having cleared just over 1.5 kilometres of thick country, set up a harbour position near the crest of Hill 7-2 at 5 p.m. A harbour position was a defensive formation that allowed for further operations while also serving as a rendezvous point for patrols into enemy territory, while also giving the company a place to rest. The most common kind of patrol harbour is a triangle configuration, which allows all-round defence. An hour later, once the patrol harbour had been established and listening posts set up, parties were dispatched to a nearby creek to refill the company's depleted canteens. It is at this point where accounts of what happened next start to differ, with some accounts listing Noack as manning a listening post near the creek, while others have him present in the water parties. But what is known is that following the return and dissemination of the now refilled canteens, Noack approached Private Kevin Borger, inquiring on which of the two kinds of water purification tablets he'd been issued to use in the water bottle when the call came out to hit the ground. Almost immediately, Noack was struck by a burst of submachine gun fire. His section immediately returned fire in the direction they believed the shot came from, believing it to be a Viet Cong patrol, until Corporal George Gilbert, Noack's section commander, apparently noticing something was amiss, called out, "Stop firing, we're Australians." The differing accounts continue from this point, with the official unit account of the action stating that Noack stood during the pause to change positions and was shot in the abdomen, while personal interviews conducted by Private Kevin Borger and Private John O'Callaghan, the two men who were with Noack at the time, said that he was shot in the initial salvo. Whichever event occurred, once the shooting ceased, it was quickly realized that both A and B companies had, unbeknownst to each other, approached the same creek junction from opposite directions, and A company had inadvertently fired on the B company listening post. A medic was immediately sent forward and a stretcher set up to return Noack to within the patrol harbour while a medevac dust-off was called. Over the next 40 minutes, the company waited tensely, expecting a Viet Cong attack drawn by the gunfire, while Noack prayed. And even though his wounds did not look serious, it was apparent that he knew that he was dying. He told his brothers beside him, "I've had it." After those tense 40 minutes, an American Iroquois helicopter landed at a nearby landing zone, and an American medic jumped out and immediately tended to Noack's wounds before bundling him into the helicopter for transport to the 36th Evacuation Hospital at Vung Tau. At 10 p.m., the 24th of May, 1966, B Company would receive word via radio that Private Errol Wayne Noack died of his wounds while en route to the hospital. In doing so, he was the first national serviceman to die in Vietnam. He was just 21 years old and had been in country for 2 weeks and 2 days. Understandably, the death of the first national serviceman, the first conscript, was going to court controversy, especially considering the possibility that the death was at the hands of a fellow Australian. With the possibility of a blue-on-blue death, Major General Kenneth Mackay, Commander, Australian Force Vietnam, ordered all communications with Australia cease while an autopsy was held, and senior officers made a series of urgent visits to the men in the field, though, according to Privates Borger and O'Callaghan, the men of Noack's section were never interviewed about what happened. 3 days after his death, General Mackay made the announcement that Noack had been killed by a Viet Cong squad, even if his brothers in his section disagreed with that assessment. Now, no war is universally accepted by an entire population. There's always going to be some part of society that is against it. Even in historically supported conflicts like the two world wars, there were people who were against the fighting, and Vietnam this was probably more specific. Now in Australia, the war had the benefit of support from a significant portion of the population at the onset, but Noack's death seemed to serve as a rallying cry for the anti-war, anti-conscription movement, with placards bearing the phrase, "The first conscript is dead," starting to appear at sit-ins, protest marches, and vigils apparently within hours of the news breaking. It is interesting that, for the most part, these signs don't mention Noack at all, only his position as a national serviceman, dehumanizing him, as if his position was more important than the man who died. Though I have seen on more than one occasion protests bearing the sign, "Who really killed Noack?" which would be seen either as an indictment of the government for sending him to war, or the alternate belief that Noack was killed by a fellow Australian had actually made its way out of the army base despite the efforts of the military. Noack's body was returned to Adelaide for burial on the 31st of May 1966 after initially arriving in Perth. At the beginning of 1966, the Australian government had made the decision to repatriate all of Australia's war dead, changing a policy that had existed since before Federation that outlined that Australian war dead would be interred first in Imperial, then Commonwealth war graves, close to where they fell. On the same day his remains arrived in Adelaide, it was reported that he would receive a military funeral with full honours conveyed the following day at the Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Adelaide, where he had been confirmed and spent time as a youth leader. His good friend Pastor Fisher oversaw the service, and in his opening address he addressed the public's controversy surrounding his friend's death. This is first and foremost a burial service. For many different reasons, it has become a funeral of national attention and interest. Errol's death has pinpointed and highlighted grave national and international issues. The grounds around the church were packed with people paying their respects, as was the road to Centennial Park Cemetery where he was laid to rest. While the media initially reported that Sandra Harrison, his girlfriend from Perth, would be in attendance, paid for by the army, this didn't actually eventuate, following a request from his father, citing that the two had never met beforehand and it wouldn't have been appropriate considering the circumstances. Errol's mother Dorothy was either not advised of his funeral or not invited, and it was tracked down by the media for comment on the 1st of June, the day of his funeral. Her responses were publicised alongside editorials and comments about the war, and she would regularly attend anti-conscription marches, speaking as the mother of the first slain conscript. His father, Walter, however, having lost his best mate and only son, never truly recovered from the news, and only wished that his son's death would not become used as political propaganda. Sadly, his wishes were not honoured by either sides of Australian politics. They either highlighted his death to either support or lambast the war or the practice of national service. In 1989, the South Australian Returned Services League honoured Noack with the opening of Errol Noack House in Mitchell Park, South Australia. This facility commemorates his war service and continues to provide emergency accommodation for Vietnam and other war veterans and their families. Despite the Army's initial statement that Noack was killed by a Viet Cong squad, it is established in the official history, as well as the unit history of the 5 RAR, and in more contemporary writings about this incident, that it seems more probable that he was killed by friendly fire, in a horrible accident. Compulsory military service would continue for another 7 years before the newly elected Whitlam government repealed it in December of 1972. After 63,735 national servicemen served in the Army, of which 15,381 were deployed to Vietnam, and regrettably approximately 200 were killed, starting with a 6-foot tuna fisherman from Port Lincoln. And while conscription remains part of Article 4 of the 1903 Defence Act, as recently as 1992, with the Defence Legislation Amendment Bill, saw a review of the provisions that allowed for national service and a more modern military, as well as how and when it could be activated. Thanks for listening to the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was written, produced, and audio engineered by me, Ross Manuel, with additional research done by Laurie Favell. I'd really appreciate it, and it would help out the show if you took some time to share this with a friend, or leave a review on Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or iTunes, or anywhere that you listen to podcasts, as it really helps other people find the show. If you want to know more about today's episode, with photos, show notes, and transcripts, head to www.thedocnetwork.net and follow the show on IWODMJ on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Don't worry, there's a link in the show notes. If you want to follow me for history-related hijinks and other nerdery, you can follow me on practically everything at Doc Winters. Once again, thanks for listening and catch you next time. Bye!